My pleasure to introduce Anna Metaxas. She is a visiting professor here. This is her third sabbatical at UQ. So she keeps coming back. I think that bodes well for how great the school is and probably how great the diving and weather is. Yeah. So she works at Dalhousie University.
In practice.
I'm dyslexic and like a lot of issues but Dalhousie.
Dalhousie.
Who is an old English colonial guy. Lord. So Anna grew up in Greece, where she was in the ocean, the Mediterranean Sea very often. She did her undergrad at McGill, her master's at University of British Columbia, UBC, and PhD at Dalhousie. Her research covers actually a really broad spectrum of things, but I think the unifying trends are in the ocean, across a wide variety of habitats, and often with a conservation angle. Welcome.
Thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here once again. It's all useful. Who's actually one of us listening to me, and he pretended, he said that I'm going to listen to you so you can say what you want, so I can say. It's his fault I'm here again today with back in 2014. Yeah, says I keep coming back. So what I want to talk about today is this something that I think a lot of you are interested in and also active in. So I may not be adding a lot to a lot of you, a lot of content, but I will give you my spin of it, and that's bridging this science policy interface. And particularly, I want to talk about the ocean, which is, I know not a lot of you think about the ocean very often. And that is basically because the ocean covers, 70% of our planet, 95% of our habitable space. And so I think it's important that we really start thinking about the ocean a lot. We hear about a lot of agreements that are going on. And so also ocean is the major climate mitigator on our planet. And so, we have, I think, a lot of responsibility to do something about ocean conservation and about that science policy interface contribute to it. But also there's a lot of possibilities because of all these international and national agreements that are going through. So I will not talk a lot about my science. I will just try to give you a flavor of how I actually came about to try to bridge that gap. To start with, I work in Halifax, which is in the division of Sipanakadik, which is part of the Mi'kmaq ancestral and unceded terrestrial territory in Eastern Canada. So first I want to talk about some of the work that I've done in Canada, and one of the ways that you can contribute to the science policy interface, and which I'll talk about in terms of Canada specifically, is by contributing data, information. When all this designing marine protected areas, marine conservation areas are being implemented, in order to make those designs, you need to know who's where and doing what. And so just to sort of give you a little bit of how that happens in Canada, Canada has 13 ecoregions or bioregions that are spread across the entire country. And the idea is that a network will be implemented individually in each one of these ecoregions, and there may or may not be connections across ecoregions, but that's the way the management works. And so all of my work is basically this one here, which is the Maritimes in Eastern Canada. So just as a heads up, Canada by 2019 had committed 13.8% of our marine and coastal waters into marine protected areas or network of marine conservation areas, rather, and it's conservation because it includes all the way to full protection through OECMs. A lot of this had to do with the very recently implemented marine protected area up in the Arctic, and you can see the other ones are all in different colors. And of course, different colors, just like in Australia, indicate different ministries that manage them and implement them. So you can see the mess is kind of similar like yours is in terms of who's responsible for what. But ultimately, it's the Department of Fisheries and Oceans who sort of tries to oversee it. So There is an attempt, this is now we're into the Maritimes, and so what you see there in all these different color boxes are the different conservation areas in our region. And so you can see some that are already established in these gray boxes, and then you can see other ones that are in blue boxes, and those are what are called areas of interest. And then what you see in green boxes are places that would be nice to try to implement to get to our percentage, but it's probably going to be a long way and it's going to be a big fight. So some of those are actually legitimate marine protected areas, like the one here and the one here. The other ones are really OECM, so they're refuges and they're not necessarily full protection. They're put in place for a specific reason. What you see in blue here, and I'll be getting back to those two specifically, are areas that are areas of interest. So that what this means is the Fisheries and Oceans basically says, oh, it wouldn't be cool to put a marine protected area here. Let's call it an area of interest. And let's start collecting information on that area, including starting to have some consultations with relevant stakeholders. So that's what the blue is. So let's start with one of them. So now I'll tell you a little bit about how we have contributed data. So that's one of the contributing to that policy interface is just by contributing data that they don't have. So this is one of the areas this is the US-Canada border. It goes right through the middle of the Gulf of Maine. And so this area is called Presser and Georges Canyons Conservation Area. It goes from depth of about 300 to about 3,000 meters. So this is the far off site here. It is an OECM, but fishing has been restricted there since it was established in 2016. It's really quite large and it will occupy about 0.15% of the total area that is being protected. So out of the 25 by 25 and 30 by 30. And the reason it was protected was because we actually went to sea on a research cruise in 2014, and we discovered this in that particular canyon. And so what you see here are actually deep water corals. These are corals that live at great depths, hundreds of thousands of meters. They do not have obviously symbionts, they're filter feeders. But so what you see here is one example is bubblegum coral. These corals can live for hundreds of thousands of years. And they are actually quite rare. This is susceptible to fishing, damage from fishing. And this was an area where we just encountered this, we just ran into this. And these were some particularly large corals that you see here. And they were in the highest densities that we had seen, right? So it was kind of happenstance. We just happened to be out there looking for stuff, exploring, and we ran into this. And so we got off the ship and immediately contacted my colleagues at Department of Fisheries and Oceans, explained the situation, had a meeting, and the process to start to close this area took only 2 years. So we found them in June 2014. The area was closed by June 2016, which was quite amazing because at the time it would take an average of 10 years from let's close this area to actually implementing the marine protected area. So it was the fastest way to close it. Now, what I should say was that it sounds easy. I walked in and saw my friends and say close this and they closed it. I have been working in that region by this point for about over a decade. And so when I first arrived and I started working off the deep sea, I saw the people at Fisheries and Oceans and said, hey, look, we're doing this work, we're doing great work, here's our papers. Yeah, great, very interesting. We need to get back to you, and then nothing happened. And then, 2 years later, another meeting show up, same papers, yeah, these are great, we should really consider those, nothing happened. And so it took a long time for them to actually say, oh, okay, let's talk about how we can use your data. And so again, back to this, and those of you that work in that arena know that the most important thing you can do is just persist and try to build those relationships. If you want to get anything from the science to the policy, and simply publish in a paper is not enough, right? A lot of the time managers don't even read papers because they don't have time or the means to do so. Okay. So that was one place where we were actually able to contribute some data and actually post this. Here's another area now, which you see right here. So this is the place I just showed you was down here. So now we're talking about region in here, which is called the Fandy and Channel Browns Bank. It's an area of interest. It's actually ongoing. The decisions about it's still, the consultation is happening as we speak, and in fact, there was a stakeholder meeting last week. And so again, because these areas are offshore, they can be actually quite large, 7,200 kilometers square. And it's a place where, there used to be, right here, there's actually a fisheries closure that is called Northwest Channel. So this is another place where we have been working. And so what happened was, what is being discussed right now is the boundaries, right? And so of course, what industry wants to do is it wants to, make those boundaries, make those areas as small as possible, move those boundaries around where they're already fishing rather than close the area to fishing at all. And so in the latest consultation, what happened was, we're discussing about this boundary specifically here. And so again, we were in a research cruise in 2019, and what happened is we were diving this general area, and I can tell you exactly where because the boundaries are still being under consideration, but in this general region. And what happened is, as we ran into an area, again, this is a different species of deep water coral, but this was an area in particular. This is the dive track that we did. So you can see the dots, all those dots indicate where there was a coral. But what is interesting about this is that there was a lot of little ones. And this is the high density of small coral recruits that we have seen anywhere on the continental shelf and slope of Nova Scotia. And so what we're finding, and so you can see this here, these are like size frequency distributions in blue at each one of different depths. And those yellow bits those are the bars that indicate really small corals. And so you don't see that. Any other size frequency distribution I've ever produced from that region does not have those little corals. So basically we were fighting to keep that boundary far east enough to make sure that we include this region, which could be one of the few regions we would have natural recruitment. And it seems like we won the battle, but it was a battle, right? But again, this had nothing to do with anything other than being at the table and being able to produce data that can be used, that the policy implementation comes and says, okay, tell us where that is so we can make an argument about it and why we should make that argument. So that is one of the ways that we have contributed. The last one is a coastal MPA, and you see it here. And this is the first sort of large coastal MPA in Canada, actually. So it's causing a lot of problems. There it is in COSAP. Again, this is now 2,000 square kilometer for a protected area, and it covers quite a bit of the coast of Nova Scotia. Now, the reason that was put in place was this had this overarching goal, right? To conserve and protect ecological integrity, biodiversity, productivity, et cetera, et cetera. The reason Fisheries and Oceans suggested this area is because it's an archipelago of islands that is relatively pristine. There's very low human development. There's a little bit of lobster fishing. There's in one particular base of aquaculture, but it was relatively pristine. And so they felt, it would be great, it's pristine. Cool things must be there. Let's protect it. The only issue was, we didn't know what was there. And so one of the species that we work on are kelp beds. And I'm sure some of you that have your ear to international issues know that kelp beds are actually not doing very well around the globe. So what happened is we arrived, just out of curiosity, we went to the eastern shore, we're working with a lobster fisherman, and we said, so, what's up with kelp beds out here? And he said, lots of kelp, and so we dove, and this is what we encountered. Now, why was this important to find and document? So a lot of the study in Nova Scotia on kelp beds in Nova Scotia has been done on the southwestern shore, and for many years, since the 60s. And so what happens is over that period of time, but we had luxuriant kelp beds on the southwestern shore that have now turned into this. This is called a turf algae. It's a turf bed now. And the kelp has essentially disappeared from most places on the southwestern shore. And so because of a combination of warming and invasive species, and so we no longer have kelp beds. And so, you go to the eastern shore and all of a sudden you have this. So that's great, except we don't know why we have this. And so since 2018, since we actually discovered that there were kelp beds there, unbeknownst to DFO when it was closed in the area, we actually tried to collect information and have a variety of projects that tries to understand why are kelp beds still there? Are they still there, but they're on their way out? Or is there something about that particular region that makes them more resilient? And so they will be there forever or for a long time. And therefore, maybe, that is a good place to select your protected area and can make the case for selecting the protected area. So that's the coastal stuff. And this is really all about, again, it's very clear. You talk to people who are making those implementations, you hand them the data over, and hopefully that data is put to good use. Now, the other way, of course, is to try to do some advising. And so what I want to talk about here is mainly something that I know that most of you are not familiar with, except maybe Laura, maybe a little bit familiar, and we're trying to inform her desperately. So, and this is about seabed mining. And so I've been involved in a number of international fora. This has probably been the most soul destroying and, challenging, I would say. So seabed mining, how many of you know about seabed mining? How many know that there's mining in the deep sea, right? Okay, so there is no mining in the deep sea, but they're trying to mine the deep sea. And so the way this is going to be done, there is the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, otherwise known as UNCLOS, was signed in 1982, and Part 9 of that convention deals with the seabed in the area, which is the area beyond national jurisdictions, right? So it's only the seabed, but beyond national jurisdictions. And so basically that part of the UNCLOS suggests that the seabed is a common heritage of mankind at the time. It can only be accessed through the International Seabed Authority. So this is an organ, a UN organ that was developed specifically. Its job is to manage what goes on the seabed in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And it is put in place to act for the benefit of humankind. Okay, and so what this means is it has to manage both research extraction, if there's any to be on the seabed, and at the same time ensure protection of the marine environment from significant harm. So all of a sudden, you have one body that is responsible for two conservation and resource extraction, and the resource is mining, which is not, the most environmentally friendly type of resource extraction. So the International Seabed Authority has 167 members. You see them there in different colors: member states with permanent missions in Jamaica, non-member states. Of course, the US has not signed, just like it hasn't signed any other agreement. It hasn't signed this one either. And so they're sort of kind of observers, they're non-member states. So there's a whole bunch of countries. 167 operates the same way, has a council, has an assembly. And then there's observers. Right, and there's observer states, different intergovernmental organizations, and then there's 37 non-governmental organizations, and one of them is the one that I work with through this for this international fora, and it's called the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative. This is a network of about over 1,000 scientists from all over the world, scientists, social and natural scientists. And the job is to sort of advise that science-based policy. And so the idea is wherever we can, in all those international fora, we show up and we try to share some science to sort of promote evidence-based decision making. So how does this work really? The International Seabed Authority gives out contracts to different member states in different parts of the world. To extract different mineral resources. I only give this example here because this is the area that is mostly competitive. It's right now the one that if there's any mining to happen, this is the first place it will happen. It is called the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. It's right here in the Pacific. It is the width of it is about the width of the continental United States. So it is massive, right? So there's a lot at stake here. But what you see in different colors represent the contracts by different member states that have applied and have them. So at the moment, there is exploration, but no exploitation. And what you see in these hatched areas, I'm not going to get into it. Those are the equivalent of MPAs, they're called APIs. But one thing that you can see is that they were placed after the contracts were given out. So, right, I'm not going to say anything else. They were placed after the contracts were given out. Okay. So you need a mining code if you're going to do this, right? You're going to mine, you need a mining code. So the exploration has been going on since the early 2000s. And so now we are in the exploitation phase. Those contracts, you can't have them forever, hold them on forever. You have to at some point start saying, I'm gonna give it up, or we're gonna start exploiting. Of course, the technology is not really there yet. So the mining code started getting sort of discussed, particularly for exploitation since 2014, 9 years ago. And so this is what's supposed to go in there: exploitation regulations, standards, documents, working groups. Is also a big process that's going on. And in fact, as we speak, this is actually being discussed. So there's a council meeting that started the 16th of March and it's going until middle of this week. So it's actually going on right now. Okay, so what can you do to convince 167 member states to consider no harm to the marine environment, and how to move forward? What can you do? Well, we can all publish, right? And I think you recognize the first author on this one. So you can publish in all sorts of topics, not necessarily data here, but more sort of advice based on what we know. So interestingly, this is a paper that involved a lot of people and a lot of workshops that tried to attempt the systematic conservation planning for the mid-ocean regions in the Atlantic. A lot of effort went into it, and basically Daniel was banned from the International Seabed Authority when this was published. The Legal and Technical Commission said, we don't want this guy around. He used to go and give president, he's banned, he's not allowed, because he published this. Nice, huh? Right. So then there's other papers, a lot of papers. These are just the ones that I've been involved in. There is rationale and international obligations in marine for hydrothermal events. When we started with the goals, we didn't even have with the mining code. There was no goals and objectives in there, like pretty standard stuff when you try to set up regulations. There was nothing. It was like, there was no, this is our overarching goal, this is our targets. So we wrote a paper telling them you should put goals and objectives in this mining regulations, otherwise it doesn't hold. So, you know, a lot about environmental management, letters about whether, you know, there's this comparison about whether deep sea mining will have an impact or not have an impact, whether we have enough evidence to make decisions like there will be, this is what we shall do, and this we know this is going to be the impact of the marine environment, which actually do not know what that is. Paper put out by again many authors, where we discussed what are the scientific gaps, how much time do we need to fill the scientific gaps if we actually want to make evidence-based decisions for deep sea mining. And anyway, this is ongoing. And the other way to contribute to these things is so you write the papers, and then although there's no read the papers, if you talk to them without the paper, then they don't listen to you because it hasn't been, you know, gone through their channels, the peer review process. So they don't read the paper, so you have to translate it for them. But if there's no paper, they're not actually going to listen. So the other thing that we do is we go to the council meetings in Jamaica, and basically we participate. You know, there's groups that go there. Interventions that just had about, I think it was about 40 interventions during the process, where, you know, the members of the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative intervene about whatever regulation is being discussed. And then we have side events that try to inform the delegates about different aspects of the actual impacts. So in the process, what you also do is we have a lot of, based on information, a lot of those papers have to be translated into something that is digestible by politicians, by whoever those delegates are. So we have all sorts of briefs that we develop, and then we share with the various delegates, and they vary from deep sea fundamentals to what is ecological connectivity and so on. So, interestingly, the regulations are going forward, and as I said, it started in 2014, and we're now in 2023, and we don't have regulations yet, except now we have this problem, which was in June 2021, the Pacific island of Nauru, which you all know, because, you know, there is a history with Australia and Nauru, and the reason Nauru is broke is because of Australia's actions. But now what they do is they're all caught onto deep sea mining. And so what they could do is basically say, okay, any member state whose client has a claim that they're gonna start mining, they can go to the ISA and say, you know what, we're gonna start mining in 2 years. It's called a 2-year trigger. And that gives a warning to the ISA, you have to deal with us. We're gonna come with a plan of work and you're gonna have to deal with us. So what this did is basically accelerated the process of finalizing those regulations. Okay, and so now, everybody's cranking, there's been multiple meetings, of course, all this was happening during COVID, to try actually to finalize the regulation. And so things are getting tense in Jamaica because what has happened is, although it was soul destroying, going to those meetings and talking and writing these papers and being labeled as, right-wing greenies and, basically by the Secretary General, what has happened in the process is the delegates have actually been educated. And so now countries are sort of saying, whoa, stop for a moment. Scientists are saying, we don't have enough. And so we need more information, we need more evidence on what the potential impact on the marine environment will be before we actually proceed. And so what has happened over the last year is several countries have actually said that they want a moratorium on deep sea mining altogether. So there were specific states that started this, Fiji, Palau, and Samoa. Then there were countries that sort of banned deep sea mining in their own waters. For example, New Zealand, this has all happened. This is June 2022 to November 2022. France basically Macron came out and said, ban deep sea mining altogether. Germany, Canada, and most recently, I guess it was Fiji, just 2 days ago, basically said, okay, let's just pause, right? Let's just pause for however long it takes to get enough scientific data to make those decisions. So in a sense, all that, angst over all those years, all that body of work, but many people, what has achieved, although it wasn't giving data to anybody, it actually educated the decision makers to actually stop, listen, and try to, make a difference here. So now where we're at is one of the reasons that deep sea mining, we're all concerned about it is that at the moment, there is actually no social legitimacy because it hasn't been discussed, right? We haven't really, society doesn't really know about deep sea mining. And deep sea mining is supposed to be an alternative to, because we're going to need the resources, the minerals to produce climate friendly technology. The idea is we're going to run out of those minerals on land and let's go to the deep sea to get those minerals from where we need them, including from that area in the Clarion-Clipperton zone. But see, the jury is still out whether we actually need that choice, whether the impacts between the idea is that the impacts of the deep sea are going to be smaller than the impacts of land, and so that will be for the planet a better way to go. And so we actually don't know whether that's the case. And in fact, I and a number of people, including Laura, have been working to come up with an idea of how to actually compare environmental impacts of land-based mining to deep sea mining, and whether we even can do that. So that's in part what I've been working with here. I've been working with Laura to try to finalize that paper. So I'll just leave you with one last piece here, which has to do with COP15. So this is another, the GPF went through in December. And so now the idea is this is implemented. So now we need to move forward. And it had several goals. Now I work on ecological connectivity, and I have been working on ecological connectivity since the mid-2000s. And so I'm very interested in it. That's what I do. So here's some of the goals and targets in this in the GPF. And wow, connectivity is everywhere. It's a goal 8, target 2, target 3, target 12, many others. It's all about all of a sudden. Nobody knew where connectivity was. Nobody wanted to touch it. All of a sudden, it's all the rage, right? It's like everybody's talking about connectivity, which is great. So what happens in these meetings, right, is then you have, again, experts that come up with ways to move things forward, including, the monitoring framework. So somebody had to come up with ways to measure connectivity because that is recommended. They have to provide recommendations on how to do this to the GBF monitoring framework so that all the nations, the member states can then go measure it and then by 2030 report on it. So who did this? WCMC basically came up, got a whole bunch of people together and had a great meeting where they came up with ecological connectivity indicators measuring progress. There was a GBF and they had no marine people at the meeting. And so here it is, in need of an indicator. So I can imagine how Daniel Dunn, who also was spending a lot of his career thinking about connectivity, and I feel about this blank here, that there's nothing there measuring marine connectivity anywhere, and we need to work on this. So this is what I'm working with Daniel on while we're here, trying to do something about ways in terms of filling in this gap or just, just doing something about this blank that is not actually a blank. Right. So just to sort of finish up, again, those of you that work in this arena know all about this, but those of you that don't, this is what I've learned over my however many years I've been trying to breach this gap. First thing is pick your role. You need to decide, right? Not everyone wants to do it, and that's fine. Not everybody should do it. If you do it, if you like to do it, you may decide to just provide data and get there. Or you may want to be, the honest broker who looks at stuff and makes this, helps managers or policymakers make those decisions. You may want to be an advocate. Whoa, that's a bad thing for scientists that don't want to be an advocate. I said we're all advocating for science, right? But it's important for you to decide what it is you're doing before you launch into it, because there are consequences and responsibilities depending on what that role is. The relationships, the one thing that I've learned is you have to build those relationships. You do many years within Canada, and now what's happening in the international arena, it's sort of because of national relationships, then that sort of promotes you because all the member states have, representatives, delegates on this international arena, so you can go that route if you wish. You have to be persistent, just because you showed up somewhere and you gave somebody a paper that you wrote, that's not going to work, right? You may have to go back and go back and go back and remember, and so you can't take it personally because these people have other things to do. You gotta be patient, as I said, 10 years for marine protected area in Canada, so you gotta be patient, you gotta, it takes time for those government wheels to turn. And if we're talking about international wheels, it takes 20, 30 years. So you gotta be patient, you have to persist, but you have to also realize that it's not gonna happen just because, you're a PhD student, you're gonna be done in 3 years, and it's like, may not happen in 3 years. And then lastly, be humble, right? So often as scientists, what we do is we show up in a place and we say, but I found this, and why aren't you listening to me? And you're just the beginning. There's a lot of stuff that follows you, political decisions, stakeholder involvement, stakeholder engagement. And so we all have, you can get angry because again, all your science is not followed besides step because something else is coming up. Your science is important, but other aspects are important as well. Again, I know people at Carissa that works in that environment a lot knows that it's all about stakeholders and what everybody thinks. So I'll stop here and thanks for questions.
You got questions? Okay, are there any questions?
Thanks for that. Talking about like papers, I feel like there's been a bit of a push to like when you publish a paper that's really like aimed at policy to then like set aside, do an extra effort to like communicate it and like get an infographic made or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Have you found that useful and helpful? Is that do you have any tips for like how to take your paper other than showing up at a meeting and talking about it, how to take your paper to something that can be used?
So in my experience, if you think about who these people are, right? So I don't know what the situation is in Australia. I can speak about national situation in Canada. And so, these people are flat out right? You can publish your infographic. They're not reading out there, whatever the infographic is at the top of your conservation letters, but they just don't read the papers. In many cases, they don't have access to the journals. That's not what they do, right? On the internationals, we're talking about, somebody who works for Global Affairs Canada or for the government of some ministry in Costa Rica or Fiji, right? They don't, they're not gonna see your paper, right? Or your infographic, whatever it is. It's sort of, if you go to them and say, hey, look, listen at this, look at this, then they may look at it. If they know you, right? They will look at it and then they may forget about it. We find that, for briefs that we make that sort of summarize, very simple, right? Those briefs are not, if they're too long, nobody's gonna read it. Pretty pictures, that's where you can stick your infographic, right? As part of a general commentary that gives some pretty basic information. So, we were in COP, the government comes and asks specific questions, if we want to do this, what do you think about 30 by 30? What do you think about including well-connected versus just connected? It's that kind of stuff, right? It's not, let me read your conservation letters paper. It's just not gonna happen. So if you really want to make a difference, you have to publish it, you have to produce an infographic, but how you communicate to whoever makes the decisions, it's going to be up to you, and it's not going to be through that infographic.
So you found that really like literally verbally face to face, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then when they come to the meetings, if they come to, so for example, the SA would have the side events and COP would have the side events. Again, you talk about stuff, you have to talk, we're humans, right? This is how we interact. This is not how we interact. And so my personal experience is the one-to-one relationship is what does it. That's what clicks it.
It does seem like also videos and pictures. I've known a variety. There's South Africa also, they did this cruise out to the canyon.
That's right.
Took pictures and that started a whole
That's right.
MBA network.
That's right.
Who's paying for that? Those are expensive, sending a cruise and diving down to.
Well, it's scientific, right? So in our case, it makes the equivalent of ARC, right? So it depends, Fisheries and Oceans, maybe CSIRO pays for cruises. Yeah, that's who pays for cruises, really government agencies, NGOs, you have Minda Road now in Australia. So that's who pays, right? And then beautiful pictures, that's what does it, right? That's how, the way we closed 2016 is I basically showed up and it was all the original directors and I just showed pictures. I didn't say, forget about the data, I was there, we barely had the data, I would just video and I'm like, oh, wow.
I think that happened in the Amazon, that area off of Brazil as well.
Yeah. Yeah, pictures are great. Text, not so great.
Yeah.
Jonathan, you had a comment?
Yeah, I was really interested in your description of the state of play of deep sea mining. Wasn't something I was very aware of. I'm interested in what you think the impacts will be. If we did have the information about impacts, do you think it'll make a difference? Often in terrestrial and coastal systems, even though we have information about impacts, development still proceed and mining and urban development, those types of things. So I'm interested, how do we, the deep sea mining, how do we get to the situation, even though we know the impact's going to be large, it's still development mining.
Right.
How do we avoid that in this case?
So I guess, first of all, society has to be informed and society barely doesn't know that, right? So we don't know what the choices are. Somebody has to make those choices. What is interesting about deep sea mining, and I don't know how Laura will know about this, is that it's the one chance we have to do things right if we do it right. And because deep sea mining is really about one organization and everybody looking in at the same place. And so there has been a tremendous effort by a lot of people to try to inform the process. And so there's hope. And I tend, if you had asked me 3 years ago, I would say, I got out of this because I went to COP because I thought that would be easier to take from this. I would have been extremely disillusioned, but now to me, it finally seems that at least, the delegates, member states are actually stopping and thinking about it, right? So there's places, it's a UN organization that works with consensus. And so everybody has to agree. And I think there is enough there going, enough states that have doubts until we have that answer that at least it may be done if it's done. in a better way, which is not that hard, I guess, to do in a better way than yeah.
I have a question from the chat,
Okay.
from Jason Flower. Very interesting talk, thank you. How do you reconcile the patchiness of the data, especially in the deep sea, with suggesting what areas to protect? For example, for the Corset Canyon, you found corals in one area, but maybe there are better areas of coral elsewhere. Modeling, of course, helps, but most areas of the ocean lack any data to inform the models.
Yeah, they do. So we can only take it one step at a time. So the problem with protecting this is that it is unique. So in all the cruises that are done in that particular region, it is a unique area. So that's why it was easy for me to get traction from managers to close it. Now, it depends on what the policies are. In particular for deep water corals, they're supposed to protect everything, all water corals. So every time we find another one, great, we'll close that as well. The problem with the lack of data is you know, an important problem, especially when we're talking about, you know, offshore and deep sea. And this is, you know, designing marine protected areas is a little bit problematic because of that. But there's also something called the precautionary approach, which means that we don't do anything until we know more. And so this is something the precautionary principle shows up in international agreements, that shows up in the ASA, it is showing up in the BBAJ process, which is recently agreed upon for the entire water, but excludes the seabed. And so basically that means don't do anything until we know more. And that's our only way forward, and efforts to, so there's an effort to map all the seabed by 2030. So if we have at least a map of the seabed, we'll have a better idea of how to target exploration. But you know, there's a cruise right now out, it's June is out there, they found hydrothermal vents for the first time in that particular area. So it absolutely, we're gonna keep finding stuff. So then the question is, do we go ahead and start plundering without even knowing what they are? The argument is made for deep sea mining that exactly that we may lose species before we even know they exist. That's a precautionary principle. Here's my answer to that. Yeah.
So you said that your first lesson was be patient, right? And you had one example where you're not that patient, you find something really unique and it went really fast, right? So should we invest in finding those unique things in the ocean or in general? And what is the price? So what will be the cost? What are we losing of, you know, like looking for this unique?
Yeah.
I'm thinking about in urban ecology, where I'm coming from.
That's right.
So there's people who are doing a lot of stuff, just trying to find those rare species and stop construction, stop building, you know? And this could cause a lot of conflict on one hand.
It does.
And not necessarily this specific individual plant or birds that persist in like one area. It's very abundant elsewhere, and it's causing quite a lot of conflict. So are we doing right things for conservation, just looking for the unique?
I'm not suggesting that we're just looking for unique. I think what we should do is understand who these were, whether they're doing, what their functions are, and how many of them are there. So exploration is one thing, but it's not always looking for unique things, right? It's looking to find what's there. We often run into unique things and often we don't. So, for example, in a lot of, you know, the Nova Scotian coast, we've been to a lot of places that we know are like widely distributed. And so when it comes to, you know, putting the boundary, right, and starting sitting at the table with industry that says, well, okay, like I can't just stop fishing everywhere. But then you say, okay, but there's this little spot that we really have not seen anywhere else. So can we close this and you can have the rest? Because we've seen the rest and it's not unique. So it's not about looking for unique things. It's about trying to find what is out there. And then based on that, so ideally we'll map the ocean, we'll know who's there, and then we can make pretty informed decisions, right? So to me, that's what we're doing. We're not looking for specific things. And you're absolutely right. The problem with what's going on in in that area in the Pacific, there's mining, is we know very little. So sure, the scientists go out, I'll be the first one to them and say, wow, there's so many unique species in an area. So let's just, you know, be careful, stop, because there's so many unique species. But they really have sampled, you know, the equivalent of this room over an area that you saw the size of it. So we can't really say they're unique. right? And also there's the question of how many species is it okay to use, right? If we lose one and be fine, or when do we stop? So these are all decisions that sure we have to deal with all the time and managers, policymakers, sure.
That's great. I'm really interested in this point that you made about how, like, they won't listen unless you publish a paper about the thing that you found.
Yeah.
And, you showed a bunch of papers where you and your colleagues have all talked about the really devastating impacts and threats of DSM. But you didn't show the equivalent of all of the papers that are also out there that say, it's fine, don't worry, you guys, like, it's better for the environment if we go and mine these minerals there. And so there's these two sort of bodies of literature that are published now that sort of say opposite things. Like, how do you think the ISA is going to handle that? That there's like this benchmark for like credible scientific information once it's published, but now there's like two very different stories being told in the published literature. Like, how does the decision maker deal with that?
Okay, so this is my biased view of the literature, and you have, you know, like tens of scientists that are actually making recommendations that work on the deep sea, and then you have some publications that come out by authors that are linked to a mining company that argues that it is better for the environment to go to the deep sea because the damage will be less.
In peer reviewed journals.
Yes, within peer review journals. But the body is not the same, right? There's not like that many. There's like 3 or 4 papers, you know what they are. Now, having said that, yes, then what happens is, you do have that issue, and then at some point, those delegates have to decide whether. So the decision is not whether they're gonna go mine at this point. Decision is, can we make that decision? Do we have enough information to decide whether there's gonna be harm or there's not gonna be? And I would say they don't, you know, even, you know, if there's however many papers are out there, they're all like concentrated in a very small area. So we actually do not have the information to make a decision. We don't know what the impacts are, you know, as you know, we struggle to find a way to compare environmental impacts on land versus the deep sea. So everybody comes out and say it's going to be better here than there. Well, like, I don't know, how do you say that, right? So at some point, there has to be a reconciliation of views by the people that are making the decisions, right? Yeah. And maybe if there's some other papers that come out from people that are not working for the metals company that actually say there isn't an impact of the deep sea, then maybe others will listen.
I think there is a lot to learn from the pharmaceutical case study, like where there's a lot of papers coming from the companies and from research. And I think they develop some methods to kind of reconcile like this kind of information. I don't know how much empirical stuff you kind of really empirical, it's your opinion, right, at this stage.
Well, the ones we are talking about, there is, I mean, the research cruises out there now that are collecting data, and they have been collecting some data to address the issue, but there's just not enough. I mean, there's no, so, okay, recovery, right? These things can live for like 100 years. We know there's been places where there has been deep sea mining, like just doing a small area just to see, you know, simulating it. 20, 30 years later, stuff has not come back. So how do you conduct a study on a 2-year time frame that tells you what the recovery rate of mining is going to be on this grand scale? Like, you can't, you have to wait for that. So anybody that says this is what the recovery rate is going to be is wrong, because we don't know. Whether there are scientists that is working in an academic institution or for a company, it doesn't matter. It's just they don't know. They can't possibly know. So.
Well, you're here for another month or 2 months? 3 months, okay, reach out to Anna if you want to continue the conversation.
Yes.
And for today, thank you, that was so engaging, thank you very much.